Welcome to this tutorial where we're gonna review how to manage the workflow approval for the vendor master file changes and the vendor bank accounts updates. Securing the vendor master file information in general and specifically the vendor bank accounts is one of the most requirements for any organization to reduce the risk of fraud and to compliance with the legal requirements. Using the vendor workflow, the administrators could apply the proper controls on which vendor master file information and vendor bank accounts required authorized approval before applying these changes. In order to activate the vendor workflow, first I'll navigate to the accounts payable parameters. Then here in the general tab, vendor approval, I'll set enable vendor approvals to yes. Then here I'll select the fields or the values that will require workflow approval with the changes or updates. So here, for example, I'm gonna enable the vendor workflow approval with the credit limit and vendor group updates. Then we should determine the data entity behavior. What if the data updated but through the data management? So here we can select from three options, either to allow changes without approval, or to reject changes, or to create change proposals. And in that case, the changes are applied when the workflow is approved. The second step in the vendor workflow is creating the proposed vendor changes workflow. So here in the accounts payable workflow form, I'm gonna create a new workflow for the proposed vendor changes workflow. Indeed, the workflow could be configured as per the organization requirement, and here in my workflow, it starts by a conditional decision whether the update is related to credit limit update or no. If the change is related to credit limit update, then we should get an approval first from the procurement team and final approval from the AP team. But if the changes are not related to credit limit update, then it goes directly to the AP team. If we review the conditional decision for the credit limit update, we can see here that the condition based on the proposed change to vendor data, and here we are checking whether the credit limit is changed or no. So here we can understand that the condition could be based on the proposed change to vendor data or based on the vendor master data. And now, let's review the vendor approval workflow. First, I'll navigate to the vendor master file, then I'm gonna expand the miscellaneous details fast tab in order to edit the credit limit. Here, we will notice the credit limit between the brackets requires approval. That means any changes or updates related to the credit limit will require an approval. Let's say the credit limit is 10,000, then I'll click save. This action triggers proposed changes. Here we can review the current value and the proposed value, and we can discard this change or discard all the changes in case of we have several changes. Or I can click close in order to submit this change. But here we will notice that the credit limit value has not been updated yet, as the update will take place when the workflow is approved. Here we can see the workflow status is changes not submitted. Here in the workflow button, I'll click submit in order to submit these changes for approval. Let's review the workflow history. So here we can see the conditional decision for the credit limit update is evaluated to true, and accordingly, the first approval step for the procurement team. So here, I'll back to the workflow and approve this step. Let's check the workflow history, and after that, we are expecting that the second workflow step for the AP team. Alright, as the accounts payable manager, I'm gonna approve this change. So here, I'll click approve. And here I can see the status still changes pending approval. Let's keep refresh until the workflow is approved. Perfect. Here I can see the workflow is approved and accordingly the credit limit is updated. In application version 10.0.32, the vendor workflow functionality has been extended to include the vendor bank accounts. This functionality is managed by the feature management workspace through a feature called vendor bank account change proposal workflow. Configuring the vendor workflow for vendor bank account changes is almost the same like the traditional vendor workflow. So first, I'll navigate to the accounts payable parameters, general tab. Then here we have a dedicated tab for the vendor bank account approval. Here the workflow could be triggered either with the create step or update step. Then here we should select the fields that will require the workflow approval. Then here we should determine the data entity behavior. Then I'll navigate to the accounts payable workflow, and here we should create a new workflow for workflow approval for proposed vendor change. This is a simple workflow with only one step for the demonstration purpose. Now let's validate the vendor workflow approval for the vendor bank accounts. So here in the vendor master file, in the action pane, I'll click on the vendor tab, then bank accounts, in order to create a new vendor bank account. So I'll click on new, then I'll give it a bank account code like 123 and bank name like HSBC. Then here I'll click save. So here we can see the workflow button, and here the workflow has been triggered with the bank account creation. Here we can see the review status is draft. So I'll click here submit. Then I'm gonna follow the normal workflow approval process. Once the workflow is approved, we can see the review status is approved. Right now, this vendor bank account could be used. And for any reason, let's assume that we're gonna change something like the vendor name. Here we can see the vendor name is one of the fields that requires the workflow approval. So here, let's say that the name will be HSBC Bank, for example. Then I'll click save. So right now the workflow will be triggered once again, but this time the workflow triggered for proposed changes. So here we can see this is the current value and this is the proposed value. I'll click close. Then here in the workflow, I'll click submit. Then I'll follow the normal workflow approval. Here we can see the review status is approved, but with pending changes. And once the changes are approved, here we can see the review status is approved. Finally, let's review the workflow status. So first, for the vendor workflow, when changes take place and until the workflow is submitted, then the status will be changes not submitted. When it changes submitted to the workflow, then the status will be changes pending approval. And when the workflow is approved, then status is not really approved, but the data is updated accordingly. And in case of the workflow rejected, then the status will be changes rejected. For the vendor bank account workflow, if the vendor bank account approval is activated for the create step, then initially when a vendor bank account is created and until the workflow is submitted, the status will be draft. When the workflow is approved, then the vendor bank account will be created and a status will be approved. In case of any changes occurred or take place on an existing vendor bank account, the status will be approved, changes not submitted, and when the workflow is submitted, status will be approved, pending changes. And when the workflow is approved, then the status will back again to approved and changes will take place and data will be updated accordingly.